Hey everyone, welcome to this session of Beyond the Now. My name is Erin Sheldon, and I'm presenting on AAC and transition planning, supporting all students to make decisions for the future. And this topic of Beyond the Now was just particularly timely for me. I work in the field, but I also have a daughter who's turning 17 this summer, so we've been working on transition planning for several years now. And so that's really become the focus of a lot of my personal interest as well as my professional interest is how do we support all students to make their own decisions for the future. I am the special education lead for the vendor Assistiveware, the maker of Proloquo to Go and other apps like that. And I'm primarily an emergent literacy consultant. I focus on students with the most significant disabilities and complex communication needs. And there's a glimpse of my daughter Maggie there. In this session, we will be looking at tools and strategies that can help our students do two things. In the first half, it's tools and strategies to help us just discover more about our students as unique individuals. And in the second half, it's validating what we've learned about our students with our students by how we support them to participate more deeply in their planning and expand the things that they have choice and control over. Some of the terms you'll hear in this session, what you'll hear the most of is the term emergent or early emergent. And I just wanted to define that at the beginning. So a student who is emerging in their skills is learning how to use symbols in AAC. They're learning how they can access language. Our most early emergent students are still learning that symbols and words and their AAC technology can express ideas. Our emergent students are really learning how to express their ideas using symbols, but they're often doing this inconsistently. They often are doing this without really any accuracy. I'm not really referring in this session to students who are early conventional or conventional. And by that, I just mean they've learned what AAC is. They've learned how to communicate with language, with either their most familiar partners or really with anyone who speaks their language. You'll see some of the strategies that I talk about more towards the end can be really useful for students who are early conventional and conventional, but these are students who can really participate in generating their own documents and their own resources in a way that that isn't really the focus. What I really want to focus on in this session is our students who are still learning the power of symbols and therefore need the most support to participate in their own decision making and their own planning. And I'll also refer to the concept of robust AAC, and that just means any AAC system that contains a large number of symbols that the student can use in a wide range of ways, combining them in all kinds of different ways to express all the different things that we communicate for. So if your student doesn't have an AAC system that can express a lot of those, and we'll talk a little bit about what communication functions are, then they probably don't have robust AAC. And in order to participate in all of this, they might need a more robust system. So for me, my first question for my own daughter, and I think the first question we all bring to this question of transition planning is ultimately, what is the outcome that we want for our students? And what's the ultimate outcome of everything we do to support their communication? I would argue that the primary outcome we're looking for is for our students to be able to meet all of their needs. And by all of their needs, I'm referring to Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something along those lines, right? So it's making sure that students are meeting their basic needs as teenagers, as adults, throughout the rest of their lifespan in terms of their needs for food and shelter and healthcare. But also that they have the skills to, and the tools, the technology, the supports to be secure, to be safe, to be respected, and to be understood, to have friends and relationships and intimate relationships and really experience belonging, and to have the technology to learn and to really be lifelong learners, to keep being able to learn more of what they want to know about until they get to the point of, self-actualization, where they've really mastered something, whatever skill, whatever interest, whatever fascinates them the most. And ideally, getting all the way to what Maslow referred to in a later version of his hierarchy of needs, which is transcendence, which I'm going to define in this session as contribution. When you get to a point where you can give of yourself to something that's bigger than yourself and that's beyond yourself. And I think that we can look at something like Maslow's hierarchy in terms of what in the speech therapy world we might refer to as communication functions, right? So to meet your basic physiological needs, you need to be able to ask for things. You need to be able to get people's attention in order to get what it is you need. To have respect and understanding and security, you need to be able to advocate for yourself, which includes being able to refuse, includes being able to protest, and also includes being able to give a narrative, being able to tell a story, such as if you need to complain about something that someone else did, if you need to, in the worst case scenario, give a report of some kind of abuse that you've experienced. And those are all narrative skills that you're going to need to do that. In order to experience relationship and belonging, you need to have the skills to have conversation and really authentic interaction with other people. In order to develop skills around self-esteem and competence and knowledge and learning, then you need to be able to use language to give and receive information. To be self-actualized and self-determined over your own life, you need to be able to make decisions and have agency and have those decisions respected, and being able to express what those decisions are. And then to have transcendence, you really need to be able to make a unique contribution, right? So when I think of how any one individual person expresses their own ideas in their own unique way or tells their own story, right? And things like writing, that would be a form of transcendence, because only one person, only you, can tell your own story, right? And so we're really trying to make sure that our students have the communication skills to be able to tell their story the way that they understand it, represent themselves the way they want to be represented, so they can really be known. And I think as we're thinking about transition planning, we also have to think about, what is it we don't want for our students? What are the outcomes we're trying to avoid? Because transition planning isn't just about best case scenario, it's also about worst case scenario. And so I would argue that it's the reverse of Maslow's hierarchy, that what we're trying to avoid for our students is a future where their basic needs are unmet. Where they are unsafe or vulnerable because they can't advocate for themselves, because they can't, for example, report on negative things that might happen to them, or just express discomfort or anything around the things that they want changed. We're trying to avoid a future where they feel isolated or lonely or disconnected from their communities, where they feel ignorant and locked in. Maybe if not having access to lifelong learning and just kind of the stimulating, enriching things that make their individual life the most rewarding, where they don't have choice and control over their life and don't have any sense when they wake up in the morning that the world needs them and needs the contribution that they have to provide. So this is what we're trying to make sure we avoid in transition planning. So what we're trying to do with transition planning is plan to make sure our students have the best communication outcomes and put in place safeguards against the most negative ones. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to a number of different person-centered planning tools. And in the handout is from Google Slides. Each of these is hyperlinked, so you should be able to follow up on any of these that you find useful. In this first one, this is a person-centered planning tool from a group called Charting the Life Course out of Kansas City. And what Charting the Life Course does is make sure that we're imagining and planning for a vision for a student's best life, and making sure we're doing those safeguards against the life we don't want for them. Planning over the life course means planning across all of the different life domains. We can't do transition planning focused on what happens at school, because our students' lives are so much bigger than school, even while they're still in it. And of course, school is going to end at the end of our transition planning when they start their adult life. So we start by thinking about what is the most meaningful day, what kind of employment is the student interested in, how are they going to spend their day? Are they going to continue with school? Will they look for volunteer work, paid employment? What are the different routines that they want in their life? What are the skills that they're working on? What kind of pace of life do they want? But also, where are they going to live? Where do they want to live? Who do they want to live with? What do they need in order to live there? Such as, whatever gives them access to the community. So if it's, will they need transportation? Will the home need to be made accessible? We need to plan for their health care, plan for just good health, plan to keep them safe in emergencies, plan to safeguard their legal rights, plan their social and spiritual life, right? What kind of faith community are they part of? What do they want to do in their leisure time? Who are the people that they want part of their networks? And plan for how they will fulfill their role as citizens of their country. So what are the roles, the valued roles that are important to this student, such as being a student or a worker or a neighbor or a sister, making sure that we've planned for how they're going to make choices and express their choices and how we're going to put their choices into action, that they're setting goals and getting, as much responsibility as possible to drive how they want to live their life. So we have to plan for our students over all of these different domains in order to do effective transition planning, and it has to be over the whole life course. We need to start, for our students with complex communication needs, we need to be thinking about their communication from infancy all the way up through transition, adulthood, and into their later years in order to make sure that they're developing the skills they need. And my own daughter has very complex needs. She has multiple diagnoses that very significantly impact her life. And so she will be leaving school not yet having become literate, not yet having mastered how to use a communication system, an AAC system, to express all of her own opinions and choices and decisions and concerns and stories and thoughts and everything else. And so it's even more important for students like her that we are planning over the life course. Years ago, when she was in early elementary school, I laid out a 50-year plan. I thought, given everything we knew, it might take 50 years for her to develop the skills to be able to communicate using the words she wants, to express every idea that's in her head, right? Such as, 50 years to develop skills like literacy and spelling. And so if that's the case, then transition planning has to plan for her adult life in terms of what she will continue learning and how she'll keep growing. And so what the planning tools at Charting the Life course do is help us think about, okay, so we need to work with the family to develop a vision for a good life, right? So what is the ideal scenario? And then also, what are we avoiding? Because the role of services, whether it's school, whether it's speech therapy or occupational therapy, physical therapy, whether it's healthcare, whether it's respite, family support, whatever we're working on. The goal of every service is to help a family and help that student be on a trajectory to the best possible outcomes, as well as avoid the negative outcomes that we know are so important to help our students avoid. So starting by laying out what is that vision for a good life is just really important. And for us to do that, we're going to have to make a shift from what special education often refers to as functional communication and think instead about the functions of communication, because we need to support students to communicate across all those different domains of their life and meet all of these different functions of communication that are so important. You know, if a student and their family are really involved in a faith community, then transition planning means making sure we're planning how that student will have the communication support they need to fully participate in their faith community and contribute to their faith community. If that student wants to live at home or live in their own home or live with other people, being able to communicate who those people are and what they want to do during the day and how well that is working or not, right? So we really need to spend time with the student and the family to understand what is that vision for an adult life. What we also know from the work of researchers like Eric Carter is that many families don't have a strong vision, a positive vision for adult life. In fact, we know that the more interaction that the family has had with paid services like school, the lower their expectations have often become. We often, as families, have spent time with people in the medical community or the education field, in the therapy services, that have actually discouraged us from really imagining what the best possible adult life is. So that means we need to help families research what is possible for this student and how can we imagine how the student can meet all of their needs, for everything from their physiological needs to their needs to keep learning, keep being adult learners, and keep contributing to their community. And so there'll be a number of other resources you'll see throughout this session to help you imagine with families and with students what that might look like. And it just means this is one of the most individualized aspects of transition planning, because we really have to find out where this family is at, where this student is at, what living in the community and doing during the day, and what their social and spiritual life and their citizenship and advocacy role looks like to those families. So that's why we think about communication functions first, right? Communication functions are all those things that let us meet these different needs and help get our students to the point of contribution where they can truly be their own unique self. So one really important tool that I know a lot of you already use is something like a gesture dictionary. If you don't, there's a link from this slide to get some examples of what I'm going to refer to here as communication charts. And this is for our most emergent students. This is where we are recording how the student communicates, especially how they're communicating in ways that other people might misunderstand, misinterpret, and not understand what the student is doing. So for example, if a student is requesting or is refusing or is protesting or uses the photos in their camera roll to try to set a topic or share a story, we might really need to write that down. Part of our transition planning is to write that down and say, you know, at this time when the student picks up their phone and shows you a photo in their camera roll, when this happens, we think it means she wants to talk about this topic, and we need to do this. We need to get out her AAC and help support her to actually tell a story or model how we might tell a story. We might, you know, we think it means she's telling a story about an experience that she's had, and we need to demonstrate some language on her AAC that she could say about that so that we could get more information from her about what it is she's trying to share. Maybe at this time when the student drops to the ground and refuses to budge, when this happens, we think it means that she's refusing or protesting. And we need to demonstrate for her how she can use her AAC system to protest or refuse in a way that more people will understand, or, you know, whatever that follow-up action is going to be. If she's refusing and protesting, then how can we reframe what's happening to see if it's perfectly fine for her to be able to refuse and protest and do something else instead. So some of the ways that this can look like, these are just some examples from my own daughter. When this is happening, for example, with my own daughter, during any activity, if you hear her making this sound, like it's this happy sucking sound that she makes through her teeth. Whenever she's doing that, she is really engaged and interested in what's happening. She really likes what's happening. What she actually doesn't like, if you take her AAC system and start modeling, Maggie, I think you like this. I think you think this is fun, because it I think she finds it really annoying and distracting that she's having all this fun and mom's always trying to turn it into a teaching moment. So what we've discovered is a good solution or a good follow-up activity whenever she's demonstrating and communicating this kind of interest is to video record whatever's happening. Get out our phones and make a video so that we can talk about it afterwards. Go back and revisit that thing that made her so engaged and now add some language to it and model about it and try to have a conversation about it afterwards. She often hovers on the threshold of a classroom, especially when something's about to start, and refuses to enter a room. So what we think that means is she's communicating some kind of distress with the physical environment in particular. She's very sensitive to light and noise and movement. And so here's the things that people need to do. They need to dim the lights and wait for the room to quiet and not shove her AAC in front of her and say, tell me what's wrong. But actually scan through. If she still doesn't want to enter the room, then go to her something's wrong folder and see if we can offer her some possibilities of what that might be so she can respond to that. So anyway, so these are just some examples of what a communication chart can look like. When our students leave school, they are going to often be with lots of new people supporting them. And so we need to have well documented all the ways that they meet their communication needs so they can be as understood as possible. A more formal tool to really help you fully understand how this student is communicating is if you use a tool like the Pragmatics Profile. This is the Pragmatics Profile for people who use AAC. It's hyperlinked from this slide. It's a fantastic tool. It's really intended for someone like a speech therapist, maybe a transition coordinator, or special educator, to conduct interviews with all the different people who know the student best and ask, how does the student show that they like something? How do they show dislike? How do they show their interest in interaction? How do they get your attention? How do they ask questions? How do they comment? How do they express opinions? All of these different things, and gathers all of the information. And at the end of the latest version of the Pragmatics Profile, there is this really fabulous table. It goes on for 3 pages, and it just helps you really categorize exactly how the student is communicating, how they're using single words or whole sentences or phrases in their AAC system, how they're using multimodal communication like eye gaze or body movements or vocalizations or gestures in order to communicate a wide range of things. And if a student is doing these in ways that are really easy to misunderstand, then we can make this even more elaborate. We can make their gesture dictionary something that includes photos or videos or something, so that people who are new to supporting them can really understand how they express the things that matter. At AssistedWare, we created this document called Reasons We Communicate that might be a helpful brainstorming tool. It's hyperlinked from this slide to help you just sit down with the student's IEP team, with the student's family, with the student, and think about, how do they communicate with all these different communication functions, right? So how do they clarify their message when they're misunderstood? How do they ask you to clarify? How do they make choices? How do they refuse? How do they protest? How do they express their feelings? How do they direct what they want you to do? How do they tell stories? How do they greet? How do they set topics? All these different things. And it might just be a helpful tool to really help the entire team understand all the many reasons we communicate and why we can't just focus on any individual one. You'll see that the second half of this session will be a lot of different ways to turn what might otherwise be simple choice making into deeper discussions and conversations. So hopefully that will, the second half of this session will give you a lot more ideas about how to do this. As part of recording how the student communicates, we need to ask what is most important to this student. And what this document here, again, this template is hyperlinked. What it does is separates what is important to a student from what is important for a student. Most IEP planning, up until the time we start transition planning, most of our IEP planning is around what we as well-educated, knowledgeable adults believe is most important for the student, what we know is important for them to learn. What has to take place during transition planning is that we make that shift to really asking what is important to the student, and start putting more weight as we balance what's important to the student, what's important for the student, putting more weight on what the student is showing us is most important to them, right? So these are just some examples from 2 other students. It might be very important to a student to be able to ask questions and express their opinions, and they might not yet be showing a lot of interest in things like polite small talk and repair strategies, and so, or telling stories. And so we might know as the knowledgeable adult, so these are really important for them. But what they've shown us with all of their behavior, with everything they've expressed, is that this is what's most important to them. And I just find that completing this, asking a family to really think about what's important to your son or daughter, what's important for your son or daughter, helps us as families start separating our perspective as the parent from our son or daughter's perspective, so that we can start supporting them to express opinions and ideas that might be actually very different from ours, just like every other kid does. And there's a few more. Again, all of these tools are hyperlinked, but there's a few more tools that can just help you think about what's happening, what all is going on in the student's life. I really like this exercise here called a perfect week, where we imagine, first we might inventory what the student already does. What do they do when they wake up in the morning? What do they do in the afternoon? What do they do in the evening? Where do they sleep? All of that. So what's currently happening? And now, what would a perfect week look like? What would their perfect morning look like on a Monday or a Tuesday or a weekend day? What would their perfect evening look like? And if you're having trouble imagining what's that vision for a student's future, then imagining their perfect week, and working with the student and their family and everyone who knows them best to imagine that perfect week. Like, how busy would it be? How packed would it be? That really depends on the student, right? What would they do on the weekends versus the weekdays? That's just so individual. But you might find that this is just a really helpful tool to start getting to a point of being able to articulate what is the vision for this student. And then I really like this tool of what's working and what's not working, where what you'll notice here, and again, it's hyperlinked so you can download the template yourself, but what's working from the student's perspective in their weekend day, what's working from the student's perspective for the weekday, evenings, and what's not working. What has the student shown us is not working? And if they're still learning to use AAC, then what have they shown us with their behavior and their mood and everything else? And now, separate from that, what's working from the family's perspective and what's not working, and what's working from the staff perspective or the classroom staff's perspective, anyone who supports them. And what we're doing is making sure that we are understanding each individual perspective, and notice that we're putting the student's perspective first, because a huge part of transition planning is learning to put the student's perspective first. So we're going to start with the student, and then we're going to move to the people who know them best, who work best with them. And what we want to do is find a balance of keeping as much as possible of what's working while addressing the things that aren't working to make them work more from their perspective. And obviously things also need to be working from a support staff perspective and from a family's perspective, but the first perspective that has to matter most is really the individual students. And so I use the same thing to think about what's working for our students with their AAC and with their communication needs, and what communication needs are being met and which ones aren't being met. You know, from the student's perspective, maybe it's very effective how they're using photographs and social media to tell stories about their lives and share what's going on, but they feel really disrespected or unheard when it's things like making decisions. Who knows, right? So we have to take the time, find out what that is, and then prioritize how is our transition planning going to address the most important communication needs that are currently not being met. And I'll give you some ideas. What I like to do is make this matrix where we've thought about what is important to the student and what's working for the student. What is the student not yet, or maybe the student and the family together, what is not yet considered important, but maybe it's working? What is not important now and not working, if we can set those things aside because they're lowest priority, and now focus our attention on these things that are important but not working. So maybe the student is very effectively sharing their likes, their dislikes, their preferences. They're very effective at getting someone else's attention. They're very effective at sharing opinions, asking for things, protesting things, rejecting things, setting topics. But they're still really learning how to give partner feedback so that they can have higher quality social interaction. They're really still learning how to negotiate and have that give and take in order to advocate for themselves. Maybe they're not yet using language to comment on things. Maybe they're not yet asking questions. So these are all things that are extremely important that might not be working. And this is where we're going to focus our goals. This is where we're going to focus our transition planning, is making sure that we're addressing what the student, what the family, what the IEP team understands is important, but not yet working. And throughout all this, we can think about the other AAC competencies, right? So when we think about Light's AAC competencies, which we talk about so much in the AAC field, another way of thinking about it is sorting what's important to the student, what we as the educated adults understand is important for the students, and then thinking about where is the student falling with the different AAC competencies that Janice Light has identified. So maybe what's important to the student, something I've really discovered with my own daughter as we've been dealing with this pandemic and being home, is I don't think she's ever been this motivated to really improve both her receptive and expressive vocabulary, to really understand what is happening. Why did we suddenly have to stay home? I don't think she's ever been so frustrated by her own linguistic needs and by her own need to improve those. And so I was able to shift those from important for, something I understood was important for her, to something that she's really clearly identified as for herself is very important for her. That sort of thing, right? And so what's important to her, what's important for her, and we can often sort the different AAC competencies and then use these to set priorities. So for example, for my own daughter, for her to be able to independently operate her AAC, that's definitely important for her, but we can keep supporting her with a more partner-assisted approach. She uses a pod book. And so we might make that lower priority and focus more on some of the things that she's really identified that are very important to her, such as expressing her feelings in a way that we understand what she's expressing and we can take action to start addressing it, that sort of thing. So transition planning is just about shifting this balance, right? Making sure that we understand what is important from our separate perspective and then what's important to the student's perspective, and really making sure that as we balance it, we're putting more and more weight on what students are telling us is most important to them. And obviously, as an IEP team, as a classroom team, we cannot do this alone. As families, as parents, we cannot do this alone. This has to be a team effort. Our most complex students need this kind of support for communication all across the day, for all of those different communication functions, all those different reasons we communicate, with as many communication partners as possible. And so the second half now of this session, we'll get into some strategies that might help draw more partners in and just give you some more tools and strategies for how to do this with our students who are not yet able to sort of independently use their AAC to get their own message across. One of the most important tools we use in person-centered planning is things like relationship circles, where we identify who is closest to the student and therefore knows them best and most needs to be involved in their planning. What this graphic here, and again, these are hyperlinked, what this graphic helps us do is really think about, so their immediate family members, their more extended family members, who knows them best and needs to be at that transition planning table, who is involved in their life through school, who are their friends and other people who are not paid to be in their lives, who really need to be part of their transition planning, and who are the supports that they receive at home, maybe respite workers, different support workers, who also know them best, right? And I'll talk it more in the last part of this about how to involve our students to validate this, because we can ask the parent, we can ask the sibling, we can ask the teacher, tell me who is closest to this student, but now how do we really validate it and hear from the student? So this is just a tool to help us take an inventory of who is most important in the student's life and needs to, and therefore is a communication partner who really needs to be involved in this kind of support. This graphic is a tool to help us think about what kind of support we're talking about. It's very easy to hire a respite worker or a support worker or an educational assistant or a speech therapist, and just kind of leave it to that person to decide what service the student needs from that. And one of the things that we want to do some planning around is what kind of support does the student need? So it's not just that a student might need to learn how to use AAC, but the skills needed are maybe a speech therapist who can help a student really be involved in planning and decision making beyond choice making, and improve their receptive understanding. The more specific we can be when we list, like, what are the skills needed? What exactly are the supports that we're looking for? Then the most likely that we can find a support person who will actually give us what we want, right? As opposed to someone who's going to come in sort of with their own agenda about what that support needs to be. We need to try to articulate what that support is before we ask for it. And it's often very helpful to think about, like, what kind of personality is most helpful, and maybe what kind of shared interest. Like, if I'm going to hire a support person to take my daughter out into the communities or to different activities, what am I looking for in the person? It's not just that she needs support to do these different activities. There's certain personality traits that she really enjoys, that she finds very helpful, and there's certain personality traits that she finds very challenging in other people, and that need to not be there. So this is just a tool to help us plan for that and make sure that we are thinking about the communication support that the student needs from their own perspective. So we're going to inventory who are all of these different potential communication partners and what are we communicating with them. I think something that happens a lot these days in AAC is we say the student needs their AAC system to be modeled for them all the time, you know, all day long by as many people as possible. We can be a little more specific than that, right? If we look at social network theory, and if we look at the work of people like Sarah Blackstone, then we know that what people are communicating with different people in their life is different. So maybe there's peers at school who will model one thing, and there's family members who are going to focus on a different purpose for communication, a different function, just because the social closeness that's part of it for the family is different for, say, a classmate at school, as opposed to a best friend, as opposed to the speech therapist, right? So just think about using tools like this to identify not only who are those key communication partners, but what are the reasons for communicating that we have with each one of those. There's a tool I don't have in this slide deck that I could add to it if it'd be interesting. It's just, it's a graphic that the same folks who did Charting the Life course developed. It's called Caring for and Caring about. And it just helps us separate, like, what are the things that we provide as support to a person, such as helping them get dressed, as opposed to being in a relationship with them, knowing them, you know, knowing someone's medical history, and knowing, like, their history of medication and what medications are most helpful, as opposed to supporting them to communicate in the community and the different activities they want to be part of. That if we kind of actually identify each different thing that the person is doing and who is supporting them to do these different things, then we can stop thinking about the support for person as being all that every single person needs to do every single thing. As mothers in particular, we often think that, you know, if I were to die tomorrow, I would need someone who could do every single thing that I've done for my daughter as her mother. And we often need help as parents to realize we can separate those things out. And there might be one person who's really involved in their life to provide one form of care. And there's another, you know, a sibling might be really interested in helping with advocacy, but not personal care. That's fine. We can separate those. There might be a family member who is not interested in supporting with everyday activities, but is really willing to learn the student's complete medical history in order to really be able to communicate that whenever they're in a medical setting, all that kind of thing, right? So just be thinking about what are all the different communication partners and what are the things that we're communicating with them about. If I'm a teenager and I've got siblings who have gone off to university, then, you know, being able to share stories and photos back and forth that might be the most important thing for me to focus on with that sibling when I don't get to be in the same space as them at the same time. So it just really helps in our transition planning if we can think about who are the people in the student's life and what are our reasons for communicating with those people. And then this is one of my favorite graphics from Helen Sanderson and Association. It's, again, these are all hyperlinked to where you can download your own copies, but it's called Presence to Contribution. And it helps us think about, as we're supporting our students, what does it look like for them to actually be simply be present in a place, as opposed to what does it look like when they're contributing? We can think of this in the classroom, right? We often focus on maybe an inclusive placement. I want my student to be educated in an inclusive classroom. But that might end up being only being present if I don't keep planning. Being present means I am my physical body is in the space. Having presence means other people know I'm there and I'm having social interaction with them. I'm being acknowledged. Actively participating means I'm in that classroom and I am engaged in the same things as everyone else. Connecting means that while I'm participating, I'm also socially connecting. I'm socially interacting. I'm becoming known as my own unique person. And if I'm contributing to that classroom, then that means we can say at the end of the day or the end of the school year why this classroom was better because that student was there. I might use this graphic in transition planning if I'm thinking maybe about a student's role in their faith community. What does it look like for them to be physically present at services? And these days with this pandemic, I mean, remote attendance is also fine. It might be that the best way to be present is actually to be present remotely. And when I'm present, what does it mean to be acknowledged? How can I really be acknowledged in my attendance within my faith community, at worship within my faith community? What does it mean for me to be actively participating in worship? What does it mean for, looks like I accidentally followed the link. What does it mean for this student to be able to fully participate and connect with others and now actually contribute to worship in their faith community? So just think about how to use that. And I will try to figure out what is going wrong here. All right. So anyway, so that's the role of this tool, and I just find it really helps us develop that vision for the student's life. And once we know what it looks like for them to not just be present, but actually have presence, participate, connect, contribute, now we can really think about what kind of communication support they need to make that happen. I'm going to try to fix my slide that way. There we go. And now this is the last part of the presentation, and I want to think about all of this has presumed emergent students who are still learning to use AAC and language to express what most matters to them. And so we're going to really rely on the people who know them best to fill that in. And now that we've thought about, what does it look like for them to contribute in these different activities they want to be part of? What does it look like for them to participate? Who are the people they want in their life? Who needs to be part of their planning? Now we can start thinking about, how do we also now validate this from our students? I'm sure I'm not the only parent of an emergent AAC user who's had these long, involved IEP meetings where my daughter is physically present, but the process of an IEP meeting is a very challenging place for her to actually participate and for her to express her own choices and exert some control. And so how do we think about that? How do we support that? How do we now make sure that all of this planning fully involves our students? That's what this last part will get into. And what I'm suggesting is the most useful tool I have found is talking mats. If you haven't already discovered them, if you are a transition coordinator or a special educator or a parent, I highly recommend Google Talking Mats. It's hyperlinked right here from this slide. It is a process that supports AAC use by supporting decision-making, supporting discussion. It's a framework and a process and a strategy. It makes sure that we're using real hands-on strategies to improve how we communicate with someone who has communication difficulties. It makes sure that we're using really strong visual supports to support their comprehension, to support their expression. It makes sure that we're providing real physical, tactual, tangible resources to help someone express their opinions and what's working for them. The research on talking mats is incredibly persuasive. One of the most essential things it does is it shifts who's in control of the conversation. If you think about our emergent AAC users and how easy it is to ask questions and expect a quick response and really only be able to hear their whole response, if they can, spell or put together complete sentences and paragraphs, that kind of thing. Talking Mats is a system that allows those AAC users to really be in control of the conversation, even if they can't yet type and use AAC in all these different ways. The way that Talking Mats work is there's a facilitator who's asking open-ended questions, summarizing what the student is sharing so that the student or the person can express their opinions, their priorities, and their preferences. It is not a choice-making tool. I've had a few people misunderstand it that way, so that's why I rather boldly said it's not. So some of the strategies that we use with Talking Mats: you are going to sit side by side with a student, not face to face. You're both going to be looking at a mat, and the mat is just the physical area where we're using our visual supports to think about whatever topic we're thinking about. We're going to ask open-ended questions like, how do you feel about? And then offer different options. We're going to use a visual rating scale. It can be as simple as like, not like, or good versus bad. But it can also be important or not important to me. Working, not working for me. I'm managing or I'm not managing, that sort of thing. We're going to use the student's own familiar AAC symbols. We're going to make sure we have just one topic per session to help the student really be able to stay focused on that. We'll have a range of options, usually about 10 or 20 options that are going to be discussed during any one session. We're going to use all that information we collected at the beginning when we thought about who was this student, what is important to them, what does their daily life look like. We're going to use all of that so that we know what options need to be offered. Plus, we'll always have some blank options because things will come up in a Talking Mat session, and we're going to want to fill in a blank and write that down and put it. And I'll give you a quick visual of what it looks like in a minute. And then at the end, we're going to summarize what the student has communicated. We'll recap that, we'll record it, such as taking a photo of the actual mat. And for our most emergent students, we will model how all of this works, the same way that we can model an AAC system. The research on talking mats is that it is effective with people who are symbolic, who understand the use of symbols to express a whole range of issues. What we are finding is that we can model these strategies even before students are symbolic. And in fact, we can help teach them the meaning of the symbols by using talking mats. So this is like kind of a digital idea of what a talking mat can look like. You will always have a visual rating scale. It will always be laid out the same way, where there's a positive end and a negative end of your visual rating scale. So by rating scale, I mean like versus don't like. There will always be a visual that represents the topic that we're talking about, and we're going to use whatever symbols the student uses in their AAC system. So I just put this really simple version here of food. So because we're going to teach talking mats using the most simple things, and then it gets more complex as we go. We can become more abstract as we go. And then we'll just have visuals of the different options. And so we'll ask the student these open-ended questions. We're both looking at this mat. We're not looking directly at the student. We're not making eye contact with the student. We're not, we're trying to actually remove those joint attention demands on the student by instead we're just focused on the rating scale. And in a very neutral tone of voice, we're going to say, so we're talking about food today. How do you feel about chicken? Is this something you like or something you don't like? And the student, ideally the student will take the icon and we'll move it into the end of the rating scale that they like. Some of our students might need dozens of modeled mats before they can start participating. Some of our students might need us to move the icons for chicken or rice or pizza or whatever, and to respond to tell us where to put it. They might not have the motor skills to actually reach out and take the icon and move it around. That's fine, right? So you're going to think about how the student can physically access. There is an app that you can download that's part of the Talking Mats trainings. There's an app, but I find that if you're going to use the student's own icons, it really helps to just simply, for example, take an old pod book and cut it up and use those, or whatever light tech AAC they have, and just cut up those icons and use them physically. If you might well discover that you want to go into more depth on something. So let's say we're just talking about favorite foods, and favorite foods might seem like a really basic thing, right? But there are tens of thousands of people living in the world right now who have no choice over what they're going to eat today. They live in an institutional setting or a group home setting, or in a situation where no one is asking them what they want to eat, or where people are making assumptions about what they like to eat. And they're not getting those opportunities to make that decisions. And so it might seem really basic, but even just having control over what you eat every day is one of those essential pieces of Maslow's hierarchy that we talked about earlier, right? So we can start with simpler, concrete things like food preferences, and we can dig deeper. So if we discover that we really need more information than what we could get from having 10 or 20 options, and maybe the next time we'll just talk about one subcategory. So if we talked before about kind of favorite foods and the student moved to the foods they liked over here and didn't like over here, then maybe the next time we'll just talk about fruits or vegetables, right? Or main dishes or snacks or whatever other thing we want to talk about. We can add more nuance to the rating scale. So for our most early emergent students who are still really learning what symbols stand for, we might keep it as simple as like and not like. But then, if you think of any Likert scale, we can make it more nuanced. We can offer things like just okay as sort of a neutral middle option. We can also model I don't know. And this is particularly important for our most emergent students. Like, if let's say we're still using the food one and I say strawberries, how do you feel about strawberries? Do you like strawberries? Do you not like strawberries? I can't tell. I don't know what you're communicating. I'm going to set this over here and maybe we'll come back to it later, right? So just think about, you can make the rating scale much more nuanced based on the topic that you're looking at that, and how the student is participating and how much experience they have with it. There's lots of ways you can adapt the rating scale, but we're always going to keep this really consistent structure with the positive end of the rating scale at the same end and the negative at the other. And based on what you're talking about, you might introduce things like favorite and love versus just like versus not like, or what's best versus better versus worse and worst. What are the things that are working for me versus not working? What are the areas of my life or of school or whatever's going on with me where I'm managing versus where I'm not managing? What are the things that make me happy versus make me unhappy, or the areas of my life where I'm unhappy? And so there's lots that we can do with this, but just keep that consistent structure as you adapt the rating scale. And sometimes some students really enjoy or participate most when, the positive is just sort of a thumbs up versus a thumbs down. You can do this. I like to teach talking mats in early elementary school. Just after we read a book, do we give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down? And we can actually move the book. We can have this on our wall and move the book. What do we think? Was this a thumbs up book? Was this a thumbs down book? Was it just okay? Was it good versus bad? Maybe what we are looking at or exploring for the future is a topic where we're going to talk about whether we think this is fair, a rule is fair or unfair, or right versus wrong, right? So there's just lots of different ways we can use it. But again, just follow that same consistent structure. Talking mats is a process that is very evidence-based to support discussion and participation, but by itself, it is not AAC. You need an AAC system. If you've got complex communication needs and you can't rely on speech, then you need an AAC system in addition. This process is always about discovering what a person thinks. It's never to be used as a test. There's never a right or wrong answer. And in fact, the research around talking mats, some of the most powerful and in some ways devastating research around talking mats is that there are so many people who can actually use lots of different words, but they have been taught that when they're asked questions, they're supposed to provide the right answer. They're supposed to say what the other person wants to hear. And talking mats is a process that gets people to really share their own opinion, right? I'm not looking directly at someone and saying, do you like this food I made you? Do you like this support person? And putting you on the spot to answer it. I'm making it completely open-ended and safe to use this rating scale to illustrate what you think of something. We're going to use a neutral, curious tone of voice because we're never leading someone to provide a certain response. The newer that someone is to talking mats and the more abstract or novel this process is, then the more frequent and informal sessions we should have over long periods of time so they can really start getting used to it. And we can start with really low stakes things like, how do you feel about chicken versus fish? And we can work up to things like, how do you feel about this support person versus that support person, or this place where you go to spend time as opposed to this place, or even this teacher versus that teacher, right? So we can really build it up to, as people learn the process and really participate and understand this is for them to share their own opinions, we can really get up to asking some very essential questions, getting at the things that people most need choice and control over. At the end, we're always going to summarize and confirm what the student has expressed, and we're going to follow it up with some action. So I'll just give you some more examples of ways we can use this. So again, you always have a rating scale. You always have a topic card. You might teach this by one day talking about food and the next day talking about, other types of food. We can talk about animals we like versus don't like, characters, superheroes, TV celebrities, TV shows, books we're reading, and really teach this concept of expressing preferences and interests using some kind of simple scale. And the more emergent people are, the more that we want to model things like, I don't know what you're telling me. I don't know how you feel about farm animals or insects or whatever. So we can maybe one day we're talking about animals that we like versus don't like. And another day we might talk about wild animals or insects. And maybe we don't like any insect whatsoever. Or maybe there's only some animals we like as pets and not other animals. The idea being that we're showing the student that everybody has their own opinions about these things and that this is a process for them to share their opinion as well. And when we discover that they really like cats but really don't like dogs, or they're showing an interest in guinea pigs that we never discovered before, then we can take action on it afterwards and actually explore the concept of owning a guinea pig. And is this something that we'd actually want as in our life, something that we want to discover? For our most emergent students, if they're not participating, it's okay. Go ahead and model it for yourself. Choose a topic, model what you like and don't like. Ask their other communication partners to model what they like and don't like. You can be looking at anything from a gossip magazine to a TV show or a book, and just modeling how we rate these things. And one of the most powerful things I think about talking mats is it also introduces the idea that there's things we like and there's things we don't like, but there's also things we really, really like and things we only sort of like. And that these are all fluid and we can move them back and forth, right? And we can model for our students things like, I don't know if I like that. Maybe I like it. As soon as we understand that maybe a student's interested in something, then that tells us that that's something that is part of their transition planning we can start exploring and discovering more of. And over time, we're going to ask, what does the student want more of in their life? Maybe it's about authors or sports and, famous people, athletes. But there's a lot of other things we can ask, right? So this is just a way to learn as much as possible about a student. And it allows us to start verifying what we've learned from all of the people who are closest to the student about what's most important to them, right? So over time. So what's most important to you? If we think about what's most important to you in a school day, where you eat lunch, what you eat for lunch, who you eat lunch with, who supports you at lunchtime, what classes you take, where you sit, if you get called on by the teacher or not, like having control over how you participate in the classroom. Is it important to you to be able to use your AAC to greet people? Is it important to you to be involved in any particular sport or recreational activity, right? We've often made assumptions about what we think is important to a student, but we maybe haven't really drilled down to find out what is most important to them. One thing I discovered with my own daughter was her clothing is always something that's been important to her, but it's more important to choose who picks out the outfits than picking out the actual outfits herself, right? So it's just a different kind of thing that you might discover as you go through. So you can set those different topics, like as we're transition planning, what's important to you in a job, what's important to you about where you live, having your own room, or having a roommate, living with people you already know, or do you want to live with someone else? What's important to you in post-secondary? What's important to you in employment? All of these can be different themes to do talking mats with. We can take the people in the student's life and do a talking mat about who you feel closest to, or love versus like versus not, and use this to verify where we right about who the student feels closest to, and have we really invited in to their planning all the people who are most important to them? Have we maybe given more weight to someone that the student actually hasn't identified as important to them or not? And so again, we can do that with talking mats, talking about the people in their life and who do they like most or love most, or who just is most important. We can ask who's most important to see every day versus just see sometimes. Sometimes we haven't asked students about different roles in their life, and so I'll get to that in just a minute. We can ask students about how they want to be supported. So a topic can be, we can go through describing words in the student system and sort. If somebody was going to support you to go to the mall, Here's some describing words. Is it important to you that they be cheerful? Is that important or not important? That they be social? That they talk all the time? We can really learn what students' preferences are for communication support and just any kind of support by thinking about the talking mats. It'll help us really dig into how they most imagine good quality support. So we can just discover as much about them and their preferences. We can even use core words as a topic card. And so the topic of the conversation might be go, and we can sort places, like what are places that the student is interested in learning more about, or things that they're more going through the nouns in their AAC system, things that they're more interested in exploring because they might want them. We can go through actions and activities in their communication systems and ask and brainstorm what are things they might want to do, things they might want to get, things they might want to have or make, or ask them what are things that they want to stop, right? And go through the different things that are currently in their life, and the topic might be stop. And what are things that they want to have stop? All of these are just different ways of eliciting new information from students. So it just gives us ideas about what are all the different things that we need to explore. We can ask students about home life, about school life, about possible work life, special events, all kind of things. We can ask students about what are the roles that they most want to explore in their life or that they want in their life. Have we ever asked the student, is it important to them, or would they like a best friend, a girlfriend, or a boyfriend, or a partner? Is it important to them to one day be a mom or a dad, right? A talking mat can help us help give the student a way to indicate that maybe being a mom or a dad, not important right now, but one day having a wife or husband, or being a wife or a husband, is important to me, right? So it's just a tool to help us get more information from them. We can go through, in their communication system, however they talk about special events and milestones, and ask which of these would you really like to have so that we can plan for these, or which of these are really important to you. So, having a graduation ceremony, participating in election day, going out on a date, one day having a wedding, being baptized, going on vacation. What we will find is that we often make assumptions about what is most important to other people based on what's important to us. And it might be that for one student, experiencing a sleepover is far higher priority than, for example, experiencing a graduation ceremony. And it might be exactly the opposite with someone else. There might be one student who's dreaming of actually being able to plan and direct their own vacation, and another student who would be all about a staycation given the opportunity. We won't know unless we ask, and we won't know unless we structure the conversation for our most emergent students so that they can participate as easily as possible. And over time, we can use this to ask, how about the support staff, right? For our students with complex needs, there will be people helping them with all kinds of things in their life. And so being able to be part of hiring decisions and firing decisions and staff improvement plans, and what are the staff that you like or maybe don't like? What are the staff that you think are better or best or good versus staff who's people who support you who are the worst or bad? What are the things that people do, the specific supports in terms of how someone does your hair or how they get you dressed that you like or don't like? This is just a process where we can, set out those 10 or 20 options about maybe all the things that go into supporting the student to get dressed for the day, and ask them which of these are most important to you. Or take your mom in particular. What is your mom best at helping you with, and what is she not? So that we can start giving feedback and we can start supporting our students better. We can do this with topics like post-secondary or future jobs, or the jobs that you want to explore. Is there any job that you like the idea of and you want to explore more as part of your transition process as opposed to not? We won't know until we ask. And then the very last part about this is thinking about how we can take an action on what the student expresses, so that if a student expresses interest in TV shows or going on dates or future job or how they're supported, that it actually becomes a decision, that they have agency over their own life. And again, this document is hyperlinked, but it's called a decision-making agreement. And in a decision-making agreement, we actually try to sit down and write out what are all of the different decisions that go into this student's life, who is currently making them, and how does this student need to be involved in their own decision, and who will make the final decision. And I would encourage you to list even the smallest decisions, like what they eat for breakfast or what clothes they wear or who's going to give them a bath, because some of our students, we haven't stopped to ask them yet if they even want a role in those. There are people who honestly do not care what they wear today, and there are people where what they wear today is a really important decision. And so let's try to find out what decisions are most important to them. There are people who can sit down at the table and they will eat whatever you put in front of them, because the food that they're going to eat today is just not an incredibly important decision. And there's others who are total foodies who really want as much choice and control over that as possible. So what talking mats can do and what a decision-making agreement can do is just help us make sure that we've asked those questions. What are the decisions that are happening? What has the student expressed about what's important to them? And if food is important to them, and there's certain foods they like, then let's make sure that we've actually written down how these decisions about what they'll eat, how they must be involved, and who makes the final decision gets asked and answered as part of their transition planning. And it's really powerful to look at a decision-making agreement not as a one-time thing, but every year of a child's life. You could start with a 2-year-old, and every year, up until 20 and 30 and 40, ask, what other decisions can we shift? What decisions was someone else making back when you were 10 that maybe now you can make at the age of 15? So it's called a decision-making agreement. There's some more support materials if you follow the hyperlinks here. But it can start really small. Wherever a student is, every single student is making some decisions over their life. And there's other decisions that are happening that we haven't even thought to ask whether the student could make them themselves. For my own daughter, one of the most important decisions that she started communicating in elementary school was the right to decide for herself whether she would enter a room or leave a room. And we ended up agreeing all the way in elementary school that if she was insisting on leaving a room, that needed to be her right to make that decision, that was actually a decision that could help keep her safe if she always felt like she had the right to leave a room. Didn't mean that she could enter any room in the school, but she'd always have the right to leave. She couldn't be compelled to stay in a room that she was clearly expressing that she wanted out of. So how much she be involved in this decision? She votes with her feet by leaving the room. She can be invited and encouraged to stay, and if she insists that she wants to leave, then she needs to be offered choices of where else she can go. Things like her placement and the courses she takes, I think this version is from a few years ago, but those are still things that I, as her mother, get to have a lot of control over. So here's how she will be involved in decisions like placement and course options. And then here's who makes the final decision. And each year of transition planning, we can shift this to give the student more decision-making rights and responsibilities as we go. And the very last thing I'll show you is the more complex the needs of the student, the more that we really might need to write down how they make decisions and what supporting them to make decisions looks like. So for example, if you've got a more emergent student where something like talking mats is really working for them, where how they like to get information is very visual. They need photos and videos presented to them. They might need a certain amount of time, like a week or 2 weeks or longer, to consider different decisions, where you've come up with different strategies to help them understand what the decisions are that they need to make, whether it's deciding what course to take, whether it's deciding what recreational thing to sign up for, that kind of thing. There might be a time of day. For our most complex students, it can be based on their fatigue. It can be based on, when they take different medications, all that kind of stuff. There are some of us who can make a decision best on a Saturday morning, and others where that would be the worst time, right? And so the decision-making profile just really helps us think about what have we discovered about this student in school, about what supports them to be as involved as possible in their own decisions, and write that down so that as they transition into adult life, they continue to get the support that they need to make decisions. So hopefully all of this information, I know it was a lot, but hopefully it gave you some ideas of how to discover what is really unique about this individual student. Hopefully you learned some strategies to verify what you're learning in the process of transition planning with the student, and some specific strategies to support them to participate more in their own planning and have more choice and control. You don't need to use all of these tools and strategies, just pick any of these that might be helpful at any given time, and you'll see different contexts that work best for them. At AssistAware, we've written a few articles that might also help. If you go to the Learn AAC section of the AssistAware website, there's a section called AAC for Everyone, and then a subsection there called Autonomy, Advocacy, and Safety. And there's some articles there about things like supported decision making. So it's not specific to transition planning, but there's additional resources linked there, as well as in the handout to this session. So thank you so much for joining me. As we talked about AAC for transition planning, here's my email address, and I can be difficult to reach on email. But at AssistAware, we have multiple communities on Facebook, such as for family members, for adult AAC users, for professionals. So you are welcome to look for me on Facebook or email me if you've got any questions or comments or feedback. Thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.